that it is an African-centered education and expect people of other cultures to willingly submit themselves to this process, I, as a black person, would not willingly submit myself to a process that labels itself as a Eurocentric education. That happened to be something that I was born into and submitted to, but I would not willingly. Don't you think that there is a problem right there?
Well, there's a problem with any kind of centric education. I mean, that's the whole nature of what we now call multicultural education. I mean, to oppose the traditional centric, Eurocentric education that focus only on the achievement of white people in this country, only on what Europe contributed to the world, etc. I mean, what we as multicultural educators, I hope, and I believe I speak for a large number of teachers, is to include the contributions of many different cultures and societies to world development. And what I would say is that the legacy of all ancient civilizations, of all cultures, African, European, Asian, Native American, is the legacy of all children in this country, namely African American children, white children, and so on. And I would like to see more of this mix being taught. The more we explore about the past, the more multicultural we understand ancient societies to be. You know, we know there's no such thing as a quote-unquote pure race or pure culture or so on. It's always mixtures and gestations and changes and evolution and so on. The problem with Afrocentric is that it ignores historical, I mean, what we call Afrocentric, or Nile Valley or whatever, that it tends to pose Egypt as the originator of all important ideas, and then from Egypt disseminated ideas and culture into Mesopotamia, Greece, etc. There were contributions, but it was not the sole or even primary source of the development of other civilizations and other cultures.
Is that what the basis of this argument is?
Probably so. The first portion of Mr. Martel's response regarding the concepts behind multicultural education, I agree with 100%. The question that I must raise is, it's only been within the last 10 years that teachers are now talking about multicultural education. That is a knee-jerk response to the insistence of the demand for an African-centered education. My question to you is, why did it take so long to come to this realization?
I disagree that the explosion of this discussion is a knee-jerk response. As I told you at the beginning, I've been an educator for 25 years. When I first began teaching, the vast majority, 99% of the students that I impacted, since I teach foreign language, and when I went into the Prince George's County public school system, the county as well as the school system was majority white. And as the years have, and I've come closer to retirement age, the population of the students in my school district have changed. And as I have worked with those children, so have various programs, ideas come down the pipe. Not because the children who are now being served by me and other educators in Prince George's County are children of color, African American, Hispanic, Asian, etc. But I disagree that it is a knee-jerk response. I think that as people grow and we really do begin to accept the concept of living in a global village, because of the advent of technology, because of telephones, because of computers, because of fax machines, we have had no choice but to interact with people at a level that never before have we been able to interact. As a result of that, I think that we have had to recognize, in order to be able to be responsive to the people that we interact with, whether it's within our country or outside of our country, we have had to find a different way to work with them, one that is respectful of their differences, but also that do not lose focus on the fact that in this country, in the U.S., is a fairly noble experiment. No other country in this world has a country where you have so many diverse peoples coming together.
No problem. I think that in terms of a philosophical concept, that there is a certain agreement here. Where I see a disagreement is in how this phenomenon is taught, by which I mean what the proponents of African-centered education argue is that it is the approach to education that is the most important, and you both sides seem to agree that the approach to education has to be one that is all-inclusive, as opposed to the system which we had before, which seemed to be one which was exclusive, that excluded a number of people. What I want to get to is what seems to be the thorniest issue of all, and that is the notion that Afrocentric education pushes inaccuracies in the name of black pride.
Well, for me, that is not that's not my quarrel. Perhaps could discuss that, but my concern about it is that children living in the 21st century, and those are the children who are in our classes now. These children are going to need skills to meet the technological age and to be successful in that.
You don't think Afrocentric curriculum provides that?
What I am seeing in these early programs that are coming about, that the needs of these children for that 21st century, the skills that they're going to need for that 21st century, we are relegating those children that I see as into an enclave type of mentality, that anything that doesn't look like themselves therefore has to be excluded from any sense of relevance for them in terms of working in the multiracial, multi-ethnic society that we have.
I guess I need more practical examples of that.
That's not the issue, Coach. The issue is, I don't think just because we have telephones and fax machines, we all of a sudden become more human. The issue is we have been human since the very day we set foot on this country. And it is because of the color of our skin that we were classified as non-human. The Constitution of the United States classified African-American males as 3/5 of a human being. This is a real issue that was written into the Constitution of the United States of America. It was a part of the educational system that was developed in this country. That is what we are fighting. No one has come forth to challenge these lies all of these years. But again, it's only when African people begin to assert themselves in the educational arena, when we began to stand up as men and women and say that we will define ourselves for ourselves, and we will determine how our children will move into the 21st century by giving them what this government has denied them for all of these years.
Well, I would point out that Tony is in large part correct. I mean, so far what he's saying I don't have any significant disagreements with, but we have to note that what we now call multicultural, the movement for inclusion or whatever, goes back decades, certainly to the 60s. Ever since I came into the system at Cardozo High School, teachers were teaching about African American history, about Africa, studying black authors, etc. I mean, and you certainly, in the 20th century, you can trace this back to the works of W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and others, John Hope Franklin, who have made an effort to include the African-American experience.
That's why I get back to the issue that you raised in your essay, and that is that there's no problem as far as you seem to be concerned with defining yourself, but there is a problem with faulty scholarship.
Exactly. What I'm saying, essentially, to boil it down, is that I'm saying that the authors that one calls Afrocentric are not within this tradition of scholarly rigor that was established by Du Bois, Woodson, John Hope Franklin, Franklin Frazier, and others.
Got to take a short break. When we come back, Tony will respond, and we'll take all of your telephone calls. I know you're piled up waiting. You'll join the discussion. We'll be right back.
All that in 10 minutes.
When you receive that check from welfare, you're like...
About Afrocentrism and about this new book, Alternatives to Afrocentrism, if you can see it. And we have two of the contributors to this book with us, Eric Martel, who teaches at Wilson High School, and Rosalind Johnson, who's been teaching for 26 years and is in the Prince George's County at Orem.
Nicholas Orem
Middle School, and Anthony Browder of the Institute for Karmic Guidance, who is also an activist around the issue. And we're about to get to the telephone, but Tony, you were about to respond to Eric Martel's last comment.
A couple of issues that Mr. Martel raised. He cited that it was in the 1960s that there was a push for multiculturalism. Information about African history and culture came about. But that push was only the result of the civil rights movement. When we began to no longer refer to ourselves as Negroes and saw ourselves as black people, and began to insist then, like we're insisting now, that our story be included in the story that is taught to all children in this country. So again, the issue seems to be, it's only when we begin to stand up as men and women and demand that our story be told that others respond to that. And multiculturalism is just the latest response.
It should be
Anthony,
pointed
as
out.
a participant in the civil rights movement, I agree with you. You're
And-
right.
I appreciate that.
And I don't disagree with that point. There is also one thing additional to that, and that is any significant societal change appears to be jump-started by something else.
And then
Let
there's
me
always a
interject-
reaction
let me
to
Exactly.
that change.
And
Let me
that's
interject and say that
fine.
the dispute here is the second stage of the dispute. With the injection of African American contributions to life in the United States, there was not as much controversy as when the contributions of Africa to world history became the source of discussion, and then the differences in scholarship began to emerge, and now you have the accusations of flawed scholarship. Allow me to take a few telephone calls and we'll get back to that issue. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to just say that I believe there's a great need for our youth to be aware of who they are, and it's only through Afrocentric thoughts and values that they're able to learn more about themselves. I work with shelter-based youth, and they're coming straight from school. I have to do tutorials, and they don't want to do that. They don't want to have anything to do with their studies. So obviously, the Eurocentric values that they're being taught in the schools aren't enough for them, and they need more. And the only way that they can get it is when you're providing them with more of an Afrocentric-based curriculum. They're more understanding of it. They're more receptive to that. There's no need, I mean, how are they going to actually accept a multicultural type of curriculum if they haven't even accepted their own culture? Okay. Our youth nowadays are lost because they don't understand who they are and where they come from. This is the only way that we can get them to the 21st century and beyond.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me get straight to another telephone call. It is you, caller. You're on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello, good evening, Kojo. Good evening to your esteemed guests. Yeah, I seem to have caught somebody, Martel, when he was talking about the Egyptians are neither of the Mediterranean group or of the African group.
Yes.
I would like to say that the European scholarship in Oxford, Cambridge, Sorbonne, Yale, Princeton, Harvard have misled us so much that I don't even believe and trust anything they are saying at all. In fact, if I read their books at all, it's just for an entertainment about how they have been able to fool the rest of the world under the pretext of scholarship.
Well,
I wonder if
let me raise the provocative question with you.
Yeah, I wonder if...
Well, let me raise a provocative question with you.
Somebody is waiting for me outside. I have to rush. That's why I'm hurrying up to go.
Say that question.
Okay, goodbye. Let me raise the provocative question with Tony and with you, Eric Martel. What you seem to be saying is that that's fine if you reject all of this European scholarship, but does that mean you accept any black scholarship because it is black scholarship?
It's not a matter of rejecting all European scholarship. That's not the issue, because most of the information that exists about Africa was written by Europeans. It's simply a matter of being able to sift through all of the information, and as your previous caller said, to find out what is a blatant lie, what has some elements of truth, and what appears to be on the money, and being able to process all of this information and make a determination.
What Eric Martel and others argue is that they may not even be opposed to the term Afrocentric curriculum, but what has become characteristic of Afrocentric curriculum as it is implemented in the public schools is a lot of shoddy scholarship.
That is true, certainly in part. I mean, certainly not everything that is being taught under the name of Afrocentrism
Not everything, but some shoddy scholarship is slipping through.
The stuff that seems to percolate to the top and attract the greatest attention is very often shoddy. And as I point out, it's very often produced by people who are not specialists in the area, who seem to think that the study of ancient Egypt has remained stuck in the Nile mud for the last 80 or 90 years, whereas in fact, as in other areas such as African American scholarship or the study of economics, it's a continual revitalizing process as people discover new information and correct previous errors and so on. I mean, a lot of the gross inaccuracies about, let's say, Egypt that were characteristic of earlier this century have been rejected. And they have not been rejected because suddenly Afrocentrism arose. They've been rejected by the general trends and schools that have arisen in anthropology and archaeology, which have rejected them because they had new evidence, or they discovered that the old evidence was flawed.
Let me get back to the telephone. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. Good evening, Kojo, and to your panel. Just two quick comments for Mr. Martell. I'd like to remind them that the Ptolemies didn't come into Kemet until around 332 BCE. But as I understand it, that the Semitic Hyksos invasion it was around 1790 or so BCE. And by that time, all the major pyramid building had been completed. And I wonder if you think Greeks and Romans had anything to do with that, or Africans. And as for the name Afrocentric, unlike Eurocentric education, at least that's more honest. It tells you precisely what it is. It's an African-centered view of the world.
Okay.
No question but that the Egyptians built the pyramids.
Let's look at another issue with regards to scholarship, faulty scholarship. And I would agree that there is a need among all quarters to be more forthright with providing information. It's a matter of whether or not people lie intentionally or if they make legitimate mistakes. Let's look at the issue regarding the race of the Egyptians. James Henry Breasted, the founder of the Oriental Institute at the University of Chicago, in 1916 wrote a history textbook entitled Ancient Times, in which he described the Egyptians as a race of brown-skinned people. In the 1935 edition of that same textbook, Breasted now changed his interpretation of the Egyptians and classified them as members of the great white race. Now we've got to stop and look at, why did he make this change? Why did he lie? Lies have existed in scholarship for years, and these are the issues that many of the African-centered scholars are pointing out that seem to be lost in the wind.
I don't think that...
And I don't have any disagreement with that.
Around, at least for me, I don't think that there is any argument for me that there have been lies that have been perpetuated, even created in order, for example, the pioneers of the West, Jim Bridger, and going through, the various passes, was portrayed on TV as a white Western, frontiersman,
yes.
when in fact he was a man of color. The founder of the first settlement at the city of Chicago has always been portrayed as a French person who was completely white, when in fact the individual who is credited with founding, even in France, through in old French textbooks, when they describe that individual. So we
great.
know.
So you have no problem with correcting the historical record.
And I don't have any problem with having children to be taught in a nurturing environment. Children are inquisitive.
Okay, I want to raise another issue here. You have no problem with correcting history, but you do have a problem with appearing to denigrate others. If the Eurocentric
Correct.
education to which we have been subjected tended to make us as black people and other people of color feel worthless, then you seem to be suggesting that what you see in a lot of Afrocentric curriculum is intended to show that everything black is good and everything white or any other culture is bad.
Well, one point. First point. I do not accept, for me personally, that my education, which I will readily admit, if we're using the term Eurocentric, this is exactly what I had. After all, I started school in 1949, and graduated college in 1966. So clearly, I didn't have the opportunity to explore, which is what I say in my essay. I knew practically nothing about the contributions and the history of black people, and only learned of it and appreciated it and cared about it and nurtured it and give it to my students in my classroom as a result of going off to college. However, what I did learn and how I learned, I also learned to appreciate and accept certain human values of Cervantes' writings, about dreaming, about idealizing, about seeking that, which they say is beyond your ability to capture. It happened to have come through a medium where the people were European. But as long as I was grounded in principles that allow me to be able to impart to my students a sense of community, a sense of belonging,
Then it was fine.
It was wonderful.
Okay, but how about the accusation, Eric Martel and Tony Browder, that what Afrocentrism seeks to do is to reverse, turn on its head what Eurocentrism did, which Eurocentrism said everything white is good, white people have made all of the major contributions to the civilization of the earth, black people have made none. You seem, and others, if not you, seem to argue that Afrocentric curricula, as you have seen it, often implies that all of the major contributions to civilization were made by black people and that white people made none.
Yes, the extreme form of Afrocentric curricula, or of Afrocentrism or Afrocentric curricula, as it has come to be used as a term, does do that. And you know what we are trying to say, I think, as many thousands of teachers around the country who embrace what we now call multiculturalism, is to show that, you know, there can be wisdom found in all cultures and all civilizations. Our students at Wilson High School study books from authors from Africa, from Latin America, from Asia, as well as from Europe. And the principles and the ideas, the quest for truth, for self-knowledge, etc., can be found in all of those. And I certainly wouldn't want any students, whatever their ethnic group or color is, to restrict themselves only to that which is there.
Let me put the question to Tony Browder in a slightly different way. Do white people get very upset anytime you try to correct history in which they have portrayed themselves as the good guys, such as the winning of the West, which is portrayed as a great thing as opposed to the decimation of the Native American? Anytime you try to change history in such a way that things that white people had portrayed themselves as being heroic in, you make them look as if they were the wrongdoers in, then you're going to get objections.
Coach, you hit the nail right on the head. Let's just look at a basic reality. There's no question that when, and then let's put aside the labels, Afrocentrism, multiculturalism, and Eurocentrism. Let's just look at truth. That's the bottom line. We're talking about teaching the truth to everyone, not just our children, but the adults as well, because adults have also been victims of miseducation. When we look at the truth, we're looking at a situation where a certain group of people who happen to have been Europeans have moved throughout the world and have colonized the world and have imposed their language, their culture, their philosophy, their history, and their concepts of God upon the people that they conquered and later enslaved. Now, when these people come along and begin to say, we reject that, we want to reclaim our own history, our own culture, our own language, and our own concept of God, then they are told that there is something wrong with you. It's the same issue that we see going on in South Africa.
Within that process, can you teach that those people who were colonized were developing, as Walter Rodney argues, class societies in Africa, that they very often had elements of them that participated in the slave trade, that sold our brothers into slavery, that there were Native Americans who were all not good, who were all warring against each other? Can you also teach within that within those societies that we elevate themselves, that there was evil?
That's true.
Or do we teach good and bad?
That's reality. What we're talking about, Coach, is dealing with reality. Talking about everybody. Put all of the cards on the table and say, this is what it is, let's deal with it all. And there are some people that have a problem with that.
I don't think that you're going to get any argument with me that clearly some people have a problem with that. That is very true.
But that's their problem. And that should not prevent us from dealing with the primary issue.
Allow me to get to the telephone. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, good evening. I wanted to make some comments that trying to know the history of Africa or be Afrocentric should come from within. But what I've noticed or realized here in the States is that most people follow the fashion, like when they wear that kente scarf or what, they believe that they're Afrocentric. And then they go as far as they think. One other thing I believe is that they should try to read other African authors, as the teacher said, that they should read they should read books from African authors. When I go to bookstores, the only thing I see is about the history of African people suffering, or I find things fall apart, Achebe. That is nothing. Though it's a good book, I read it in high school, but I think it's outdated.
Things fall apart. Well,
yes.
He's even updated it. Let's get back to the telephone and take another call. You're on the air, caller. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, I want to know if Mr. Browder can give a working definition of African-centered education. And I also would like to know, with all due respect to Ms. Johnson and Mr. Martell, as high school teachers, I was just wondering, you know, what qualifies them to speak on this subject? I mean, in terms of academia, in terms of scholarship, are you published in any, do you have any type of other publications? Or have you, you know, is your background in American history? I'd just like to know what qualifies them to speak on this subject.
Well, my background is in American history primarily, and I do not present myself as an expert or specialist on this topic. My journey into this issue began when I was working as a curriculum writer for the D.C. Public Schools and was presented with a number of Afrocentric materials, which to my knowledge was somewhat questionable. What I then did was to get in touch with Egyptologists, classicists such as Frank Snowden at Howard University and Frank Yurko at the Field Institute in Chicago, and since then many others, to ask them, you know, what is the current knowledge about this particular topic or these particular issues. And it is from that I began to look further into the subject. So I don't claim to be an expert, but what I do say is that, as I've said several times already, that many of the people who are presenting this Afrocentric information are themselves not specialists. You know, I think a good analogy is, you know, if you want to take your child to get medical treatment, you go to someone who is an MD. You don't go to someone who is, you know, a non-licensed practitioner. I think, you know, if you want to correct history, you go to those who have the historical training, who have written, who have a knowledge of the body of literature in that particular field, and it is from them, with lots of disagreements and different points of view, that you begin to extract information to write in curriculum. You don't go to people who can't speak or read hieroglyphs or whatever.
Let me add an amendment to that analogy, and that is, if you've been watching public television, you know that Bill Moyers has been running a series called Alternatives to Modern Medicine, and in the same way that the traditional curriculum has come into question, what Afrocentrism is an alternative to curriculums about which there is as much debate as there are the debate over alternatives to medicine, and it's a debate, frankly, that you should get involved in, because that's all the time we have to get involved in it. Tonight we got to take a break, and when we come back, we'll tell you about the new play at Howard University.
I will answer the callers'